In the history of British crime, some names have left scars so deep that even decades later, people still whisper them with unease. These are not the stories of cold, distant figures from history books. These are women, living among ordinary streets, who shocked the UK with acts so dark that they changed communities forever. Tonight, we're diving into the cases of the most evil women killers that left Britain horrified. But before we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you want daily deep dives into true crime, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new case. Lakhvir Kaur Singh, 2009, London. On the night of January 27, 2009, in a quiet corner of West London, paramedics rushed into a modest flat. Inside, they found a 39-year-old man named Lakhvinder Lucky Chima, doubled over in agony. He was vomiting, sweating, his skin pale. His fiancée, Gurjeet, was slumped nearby, also violently ill, but still clinging to life. The smell of freshly cooked curry lingered in the air. What no one in that room knew yet was that this was no ordinary medical emergency. This was the result of a rare and deadly plant, aconite, also known as wolfsbane, one of the most toxic substances in nature. Within hours, Lucky Chima was gone. His fiancée barely survived after emergency treatment. And within days, suspicion began to circle a woman from his past, Lakhvir Kaur Singh, a woman scorned, who would soon earn the grim nickname the press gave her, the curry poisoner. Lakhvir Singh was 45 at the time, a respected woman in her Southall community. Outwardly, she lived a conventional life, a wife, a mother, a figure who fit the mold of responsibility. But behind closed doors, she had been entangled in a 16-year secret affair with Lucky Chima, who was several years younger. For nearly 2 decades, their relationship simmered in secrecy, passion, and control. But things began to unravel when Lucky, tired of the deception, decided to move on. He became engaged to a younger woman, Gurjeet. To him, it was a fresh start. To Lakhvir, it was betrayal. This is where the story takes a chilling turn. Unlike most broken relationships that end with bitter words or silent distance, Lakhvir plotted revenge. In late January 2009, she obtained a small amount of aconite. For most people, this plant is obscure, even unheard of. But in some South Asian traditions, aconite had historic uses, carefully controlled, in herbal remedies. In larger doses, it's nothing short of lethal. A single gram can shut down the body's nervous system, leading to paralysis, cardiac arrest, and death. It's so rare in modern cases that when paramedics encountered Lucky, they initially had no idea what could cause such sudden and intense poisoning. Armed with this deadly ingredient, Lakhvir cooked. She prepared a dish of curry, familiar, comforting, something her ex-lover had shared with her countless times before. But this one carried a secret. She delivered it to Lucky's home, where he and his fiancée ate. That evening, the nightmare began. Lucky's condition spiraled quickly, while Gurjeet collapsed into fits of pain. He was rushed to hospital, but died soon after arrival. She was placed in intensive care and managed to survive. Her testimony would later be crucial in court. The police investigation began immediately. What made this case unique was the weapon itself. Detectives were puzzled at first. The symptoms didn't match typical food poisoning or household chemicals. They sent toxicology samples for urgent analysis. Within days, the results came back. Aconite poisoning. The plant is sometimes called the Queen of Poisons, for good reason. It was virtually unheard of in modern British crime, making this case stand out. Attention quickly turned to those closest to Lucky. Detectives learned that Lucky had recently broken off a long relationship with an older woman, Lakhvir. Witnesses described her as angry and possessive after he became engaged to another woman. Investigators visited her home, and what they found confirmed their suspicions. Police discovered a container of dried aconite in her possession. Not only that, but witnesses recalled seeing her near Lucky's residence shortly before the poisoning. The chain of evidence tightened. Soon, she was arrested. During questioning, she denied any involvement, presenting herself as a wronged woman, hurt but innocent. Yet the evidence told a different story. Traces of aconite matched those found in Lucky's system. The curry dish became the silent witness against her. The trial began in 2010 at the Old Bailey, one of the UK's most famous courts. The case shocked the public, partly because it felt like something from a Victorian crime novel. Poisons like arsenic and aconite had a long, dark history in Britain during the 1800s, when they were used by so-called black widows and hidden in meals or drinks. But in the modern world, poison killings are rare, especially by women. Prosecutors painted a picture of obsession and jealousy. They argued that Lockyer couldn't accept her lover moving on and plotted revenge in the most intimate way possible, through food. Her defense team tried to cast doubt, suggesting there was no direct proof she cooked or delivered the fatal curry. But the toxicology evidence, combined with her possession of aconite, left little room for doubt. The jury found her guilty of murder for the death of Lucky Chima and guilty of attempted murder for the attack on his fiancée Gurjeet. The sentencing was stern, life imprisonment with a minimum of 23 years before parole eligibility. Media headlines were quick to sensationalize, dubbing her the curry killer or curry poisoner. The nickname stuck, though many pointed out it reduced a deeply tragic story to something almost tabloid. Still, the case gripped the public imagination. The idea of a trusted dish of food becoming a weapon was both horrifying and fascinating. From a psychological perspective, experts noted the case revealed traits of control, possessiveness, and hidden rage. For nearly 2 decades, Lockyer had lived a double life, balancing a marriage with a secret affair. When her lover finally broke free, she chose not to let go, but to destroy. Her use of aconite was particularly chilling. It wasn't an impulsive act, but one requiring planning, sourcing, and execution. Public reaction was swift. Many in London's Southall community, where both Lockyer and Lucky lived, were stunned. Both families were respected, and the betrayal of trust ran deep. The case also sparked discussions about cultural silence around affairs and secret relationships, and how they can fester into dangerous outcomes if left unresolved. Years later, the case remains a cautionary tale. It's not remembered as loudly as infamous British cases, but among those who follow crime stories, it stands out as one of the most unusual in modern UK history. A middle-aged woman, outwardly ordinary, using one of the world's most ancient poisons to end a relationship on her own terms. Inside prison, Lockyer Singh has maintained a low profile. She will not even be considered for release until the early 2030s. By then, she will be in her 70s. For the families involved, however, the scars are permanent. Dina Thompson, 2003, West Sussex. When officers entered a quiet home in West Sussex in 2003, they weren't expecting to uncover one of Britain's most notorious fraudsters, and certainly not a woman who had just taken the life of her partner in cold blood. On the surface, the victim, Julian Webb, appeared to have died suddenly, perhaps of natural causes. But as investigators dug deeper, suspicion began to twist in an unsettling direction. The woman at the center of it all, Dina Thompson, was already known to police, not for violence, but for her ability to manipulate, deceive, and steal. What they would discover in the months that followed would earn her a chilling nickname in the British press, the Black Widow. Dina Thompson didn't look like the archetype of a career criminal. Born in 1960, she grew up in London and lived what seemed like an ordinary life. Friends and acquaintances often described her as charming, intelligent, and persuasive, but behind that outward confidence was a woman who lived by deception. Over the years, Thompson became a skilled con artist, targeting men she met through dating services or social circles, building relationships quickly and then bleeding them financially. By the late 1990s, she had left a trail of fraud behind her. Police were aware of her schemes, but she had always managed to stay one step ahead of serious charges. That changed when she met Julian Webb. Julian was a 37-year-old computer consultant, stable, successful, and hoping to build a future. He met Dina in the late 1990s, and from the start, she seemed perfect, attentive, affectionate, and eager to build a life together. What Julian didn't realize was that he was stepping into a web of lies carefully spun by a woman who had already conned multiple men before him. By 2002, the cracks began to show. Friends and family noticed Julian becoming distant, stressed, and financially strained. Meanwhile, Dina was living beyond her means, drawing money from him and engaging in dubious financial schemes. Then, in January 2003, Julian died suddenly in his home. At first, it appeared to be a tragic but natural death. He was relatively young, but sudden cardiac events weren't unheard of. But his family wasn't convinced. They pushed for answers, suspecting that something was terribly wrong. The post-mortem revealed the chilling truth. Julian hadn't died of natural causes. He had been poisoned. Toxicology tests pointed to a deliberate act, not an accident. And who had been closest to him in those final days? The woman he trusted most, Dina Thompson. Police reopened their files on her, pulling together her long history of deception. What they found painted a damning picture. Dina had conned dozens of men before Julian, draining their savings, forging documents, and manipulating them emotionally. But this time, she had crossed a line from fraud into something irreversible. Detectives arrested her. During interrogation, she remained calm, collected, even smug at times. She denied harming Julian, insisting she loved him and would never hurt him. But investigators knew better. The pattern of her behavior, combined with forensic evidence, was too strong to ignore. At her trial in 2003, the court heard a disturbing story of manipulation, greed, and cold-blooded calculation. Prosecutors described her as a woman who viewed relationships as business transactions. If a man could be exploited for money, she pursued him. If he became an obstacle, she found ways to remove him. In Julian's case, they argued, she saw him not as a partner, but as an investment. When his usefulness ended, she eliminated him. The exact method of poisoning was debated in court, but experts agreed it was intentional and consistent with her previous schemes involving control and deceit. The jury took little time to reach a verdict. Dina Thompson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term set before eligibility for parole. The press descended on the story. Headlines branded her the Black Widow, comparing her to predatory spiders that mate and then kill. The public was both horrified and fascinated. Here was a woman who didn't fit the stereotype of a violent killer. Instead, she used charm, patience, and deception, all hidden behind the mask of a caring partner. Psychologists later analyzed her behavior, describing traits consistent with manipulation, narcissism, and lack of empathy. She seemed to thrive on control, finding satisfaction not just in the money she took, but in the power she held over her partners. One chilling detail that stuck with many observers was how ordinary she appeared in public. Neighbors described her as polite, friendly, even warm at times. Yet in private, she was orchestrating frauds and ultimately planning a killing. The case had ripple effects. It raised questions about how someone could operate scams for so long without significant intervention, and how easily trust could be exploited in intimate relationships. Dating scams and relationship fraud were nothing new, but Thompson's case highlighted the darker potential of such manipulations when they escalated beyond financial harm. For Julian Webb's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no real closure. They had lost a son and brother to someone they had once welcomed into their lives. Dina Thompson's life behind bars was less dramatic than her years of deception. She faded from headlines as other cases emerged, though her story remained a reference point whenever discussions of Black Widow killers resurfaced in the media. She served nearly 2 decades before her case again made news in 2022, when she was quietly released on parole after serving the required portion of her sentence. By then, she was in her early 60s. Her release sparked fresh outrage from those who felt she had never shown true remorse. Critics argued that someone who had taken a life and deceived so many others should not be free. The parole board defended its decision, noting that she had served her minimum term and was subject to strict conditions. Still, for many, the idea of the Black Widow walking free was unsettling. What makes this case stand out is not just the act itself, but the method and the mindset behind it. Poisoning is often seen as a weapon of patience and calculation, requiring time, planning, and intent. Thompson's use of it fit perfectly with her personality, controlled, deliberate, and manipulative. Today, Dana Thompson lives under strict supervision, her freedom limited, her name permanently associated with one of Britain's darkest labels. Sarah Williams with Katrina Walsh, 2016, Lancashire. It was January 2016, and in a quiet village in Lancashire, police officers stood frozen at the doorway of a modern detached home. Inside, the scene was chilling. A woman lay lifeless in the hallway, the victim of a cold and calculated attack. Her name was Sadie Hartley, a successful businesswoman, mother, and partner. What investigators would soon uncover was not just a crime of passion, but the result of months of meticulous planning by two women, Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh. This case, later dubbed one of the most shocking love rival crimes in Britain, would grip the nation. And it all began with jealousy that spiraled into obsession. To understand the story, we need to go back. Sarah Williams, 35 at the time, was a riding instructor and former glamorous competition skier. Outwardly, she seemed like someone who had it all: friends, a social life, and confidence. But beneath the surface, Sarah was obsessed with a man named Ian Johnston. Ian was in his early 50s, a former firefighter and mountaineer. He had briefly dated Sarah, but by 2014 he had settled into a serious relationship with another woman, Sadie Hartley, a vivacious, driven businesswoman with a thriving career. For most people, an old relationship fades into the past. But for Sarah, Ian's new partner became an enemy. Friends later described her as fixated on Sadie, stalking her online, tracking her movements, and confiding in her close friend Katrina Walsh about her growing resentment. Katrina Walsh was in her 50s, an unlikely partner in crime. Known as eccentric, she worked with horses and had an interest in writing detailed diaries. She was also in a relationship with a man who didn't suspect how deeply involved she was becoming in Sarah's vendetta. Sarah leaned on Katrina as her confidant. Over time, the conversations turned darker. She helped. She became the planner, the note-taker, and the quiet presence in the background, fueling Sarah's fixation with Sadie. This wasn't a spontaneous act. Evidence later revealed that the plot was hatched over months. Walsh's diaries became a central piece of evidence. She wrote chillingly casual notes about meetings with Sarah, the purchase of equipment, and the building tension around their plan. Sarah and Katrina carried out surveillance. They placed a tracking device on Ian Johnston's car to monitor his movements. They scoped out Sadie's home, learning her daily routines. Sarah even posed as someone offering free spa treatments, luring Sadie into conversation under the guise of friendliness, all while secretly plotting her downfall. By January 2016, the plan was finalized. On January 14th, Sarah Williams drove to Sadie's home. Disguised and armed, she knocked on the door. When Sadie opened it, she was attacked in her own hallway. It was a brutal, swift act, one that left her with no chance of survival. Sarah fled, leaving the quiet Lancashire neighborhood stunned. Sadie's body was discovered later, and from the very first moments, police recognized that this wasn't a random act of violence. It was targeted, deliberate, and deeply personal. Lancashire police moved quickly. Within hours, suspicion turned towards Sadie's partner, Ian Johnston, as is common in cases involving intimate partners. But Ian was distraught, cooperative, and soon cleared. Attention shifted to Sarah Williams. Police discovered her connection to Ian, and more importantly, they uncovered a web of evidence pointing to her and Katrina Walsh. The breakthrough came from surveillance cameras and digital footprints. CCTV footage showed Sarah's movements around Sadie's house. Diaries seized from Walsh's home painted an even clearer picture, a written record of the conspiracy. Entries described trips to buy weapons, late-night planning sessions, and even the moment Katrina noted Sarah had done the deed. Perhaps the most chilling part of the investigation was how methodical and cold-blooded the planning had been. Walsh's diary entries were almost casual, as if they were planning a holiday rather than someone's death. In July 2016, Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh went on trial at Preston Crown Court. The prosecution laid out the evidence. Sarah as the one who carried out the attack, and Katrina as the enabler who helped design and support the plan. Jurors heard how Sarah had once described herself as a bunny boiler, referencing the infamous film Fatal Attraction. Friends testified about her obsession with Ian and her resentment toward Sadie. Walsh's own words, recorded in her diary, were read aloud, giving the jury a window into the twisted collaboration. Sarah tried to argue that she hadn't intended to kill, only to hurt. But the level of planning told a different story. The jury wasn't convinced by her attempts to downplay the crime. After weeks of testimony, both women were found guilty of murder. In August 2016, Sarah Williams was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years in prison. Katrina Walsh received 25 years. The judge called it a cold-blooded, premeditated crime, describing Sarah as manipulative and controlling, and Walsh as a willing accomplice. The case shocked Britain not only for the brutality of the crime, but because of who the perpetrators were. These weren't hardened criminals. They were women who moved in ordinary circles, one a riding instructor, the other a horse trainer. The fact that two seemingly unremarkable people could orchestrate such a calculated killing unnerved the public. Media outlets labeled Sarah the bunny boiler killer and highlighted the bizarre partnership between her and Walsh. The case was dissected across newspapers, talk shows, and documentaries, leaving the haunting reminder that obsession can turn into something deadly. At the heart of it, this was a story about obsession, jealousy, and the dangerous spiral of refusing to let go. Sadie Hartley was a woman who had built a full and successful life, only to have it stolen by someone else's resentment. For Sarah Williams and Katrina Walsh, their futures ended the moment they carried out their plan. Both women remain in prison, their lives defined by one night in January 2016. And for those who followed the case, it remains one of the most chilling reminders that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from strangers, but from people who simply can't let go of the past. Sabrina Coiter with Wissem Medouni, 2017, London. It was September 2017 in southwest London when firefighters were called to a quiet residential street in Wimbledon. Neighbors had seen smoke billowing from a garden. At first, it looked like nothing more than a rubbish fire, until one neighbor noticed something chilling. The fire seemed far too big, and the smell was wrong. When the flames were finally put out, investigators discovered a shocking truth. What was burning wasn't rubbish at all. It was the remains of a young woman. That discovery sent shockwaves across London, and soon the story of Sabrina Coiter and her partner Wissem Medouni would unfold, a story of obsession, paranoia, and delusion that spiraled into unthinkable tragedy. Sabrina Coiter was a French-born woman in her 30s, living in London with her partner Wissem Medouni and their children. By all appearances, she lived a glamorous life. She had once worked as a stylist and a makeup artist, and she was known in certain social circles for her charm and beauty. Some even described her as a woman who always wanted to be seen as larger than life, someone who wanted attention, recognition, and validation. But beneath that polished surface, there were cracks. Sabrina's personality often drew people in, but her relationships tended to be turbulent. She had a volatile temper, a controlling streak, and a tendency toward paranoia. These traits would eventually take her down a very dark road. The victim was Sophie Lionnet, a 21-year-old au pair from Troyes, France. Sophie was quiet, gentle, and came from a close-knit family. She had taken the job with Coiter and Medouni in 2015, moving to London to look after their 2 children. Friends and family described Sophie as sweet, caring, and somewhat shy. She wasn't the type to cause conflict. But life in the Coiter household was far from easy. Sophie: I was underpaid, isolated, and expected to work long hours. Over time, she became trapped in a situation that left her emotionally worn down. This is where Sabrina's paranoia became deadly. Coiter convinced herself, and eventually her partner, that Sophie was secretly plotting against her. She believed Sophie was working with her ex-boyfriend Mark Walton, a former member of the boy band Boyzone. Walton and Quider had a brief relationship years earlier, and after it ended, Sabrina became fixated on him. In her mind, Walton was orchestrating some grand conspiracy, and she accused Sophie of being part of it. According to Quider, Sophie was a spy planted to harm her and her family. These delusions grew stronger with time, and Wissem Medouni, instead of challenging them, fell deeper under Sabrina's influence. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, life inside the household grew more disturbing. Sophie's family back in France noticed that her phone calls became less frequent, and when she did speak, she seemed drained and fearful. Neighbors later recalled seeing Sophie looking thin, withdrawn, and timid. She rarely left the house on her own. It was clear she was living under intense pressure, but the full extent of it wouldn't be revealed until after the crime. On September 20th, 2017, neighbors saw smoke rising from the back garden of Sabrina Coider's house in Wimbledon. They called emergency services, who arrived to find Coider and Medouni tending to a bonfire. When questioned, the couple gave odd, conflicting explanations. They said they were simply burning rubbish, but something felt off. The fire was too large, and their behavior too nervous. Once investigators looked closer, they realized the horrifying truth. The fire was being used to dispose of Sophie Lyonnette's body. She had been unalived inside that very house. Police immediately arrested Sabrina Coider and Wissem Medouni. In interviews, Coider stuck to her story, claiming Sophie had been part of a conspiracy. She insisted that Sophie was spying, that she couldn't be trusted, and that what happened was somehow justified. But to detectives, her words revealed something else entirely. Not a woman defending herself, but a woman lost in delusion and paranoia, dragging her partner along with her. The trial began in 2018 at the Old Bailey in London. It drew huge media attention, not just because of the crime itself, but because of the bizarre nature of Coider's accusations. Prosecutors described her as manipulative, controlling, and paranoid. They explained how she had convinced Medouni to go along with her distorted version of reality. Together, the couple had interrogated Sophie, forcing her into false confessions about working with Mark Walton, confessions that were entirely baseless. The jury listened to recordings Coider had made of Sophie, where the young au pair's voice sounded defeated, frightened, and broken. It painted a heartbreaking picture of just how much she had suffered in her final days. In May 2018, Sabrina Coider and Wissem Medouni were both found guilty of murder. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 30 years before they could even be considered for release. For Sophie's family, the verdict brought some justice, but it could never undo the loss of their daughter. Her mother described her as gentle and kind, and her death as an unimaginable nightmare. The case was widely covered in the UK and France, with many struggling to understand how an ordinary family setting could turn into a crime scene of such cruelty. The media often described Coider as a woman consumed by paranoia, while some commentators pointed out the dangers of unchecked obsession and control within time-mate relationships. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of au pairs and domestic workers, young women often living far from home, isolated, and dependent on their employers. Sophie's story served as a tragic reminder of what can happen when that dependency turns into exploitation. Emma Jane Magson, 2016, Leicester. It's the middle of the night in Leicester, March 2016. Emergency services are called to a small house, where a young woman's voice trembles down the line. She claims her boyfriend has collapsed, that something is wrong with him, that she needs help. But when paramedics arrive, they don't find a man who has suddenly fallen ill. They find James Knight, a 26-year-old lorry driver, lying unresponsive, his chest marked by one deep wound. Standing nearby is his girlfriend, 23-year-old Emma Jane Magson. At first glance, she looks distraught, but there's something about her behavior that unsettles the responders. Her words don't quite match the situation. She doesn't appear frantic in the way one would expect, and that single wound in James's chest, it tells a different story than the one Emma is giving. This is where one of Leicester's most notorious domestic crime cases began. To understand this case, you need to know a little about both of them. James Knight was described by friends and family as kind-hearted, easygoing, and someone who tried to see the good in others. He was young, hard-working, and devoted to his family. At the time of his death, he had been dating Emma for just under a year. Emma Jane Magson, on the other hand, had a very different reputation. By 2016, she was in her early 20s, but already known for a temper that could flare at the slightest provocation. Those close to her described her as someone who struggled with emotional control. She wasn't a hardened criminal, she was an ordinary woman, but one who often found herself in volatile situations. From the outside, their relationship looked turbulent. Friends recalled heated arguments and frequent breakups, followed by reconciliations. To some it seemed like the sort of young love that burned too hot, but few could have predicted just how far it would spiral. On the night of March 27, 2016, Emma and James had been drinking together. Arguments sparked, nothing unusual for the couple. But sometime during the early hours, things turned violent. What exactly triggered Emma remains unclear, but in the middle of that argument, she grabbed a small kitchen knife, and in one sudden motion, she struck James in the chest. The wound was severe. James staggered and collapsed, and despite Emma later claiming she panicked and didn't realize how serious it was, her actions after the stabbing raised major questions. Instead of immediately calling for help, she delayed. Accounts show she took almost 45 minutes before ringing emergency services, and when she finally did, the call she made painted a confusing picture. She didn't clearly say that James had been stabbed. Instead, she told the operator he had collapsed, that he was unwell. By the time paramedics reached the scene, it was too late. James Knight could not be saved. From the very beginning, detectives were suspicious. Emma's story had too many gaps. She tried to suggest that James had simply fallen, or that he had been injured in some other way, but forensic evidence inside the home told the truth. The knife was recovered. The wound was examined, and it became clear that James hadn't suffered some accident. He had been deliberately harmed. Police also studied Emma's behavior that night. In interviews, she struggled to explain the delay in calling for help. She claimed she panicked, that she didn't fully understand the seriousness of the situation. But prosecutors later argued that her hesitation may have cost James his life, that earlier medical intervention might have saved him. Emma was charged with murder. In 2016, her case went before Leicester Crown Court. The prosecution laid out the story of a young woman with a fiery temper who lashed out in anger, then failed to get help quickly enough for her partner. They highlighted her inconsistencies, the way she described James's injury as if it were minor, even as he lay fatally wounded. They pointed to the delay in calling emergency services, and they emphasized the troubled, often hostile dynamic between the couple. Emma's defense team, however, painted a very different picture. They argued that she hadn't intended to unalive James, that it was the result of a sudden argument, not premeditation. They suggested her mental health struggles and emotional state played a role in her behavior. Despite the defense's arguments, the jury was not convinced. Emma Jane Magson was found guilty of murder in 2016 and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 17 years to serve. But this case didn't end there. Emma appealed her conviction, and in 2021, after years of legal back and forth, the Court of Appeal quashed her original conviction and ordered a retrial. The basis of the appeal was that new evidence relating to her mental health, specifically conditions that might have affected her ability to respond rationally, had not been fully explored in the first trial. At the retrial in 2021, her defense once again argued that she hadn't intended to kill James, that she struggled with emotional regulation, and that her delayed call to emergency services was not calculated, but the result of confusion and panic. Still, the jury heard the same disturbing facts. James had been unarmed. He had been stabbed in the chest during an argument, and Emma had failed to act quickly enough afterward. In May 2021, after careful deliberation, The jury reached the same conclusion as before. Emma Jane Magson was once again found guilty of murder. Her life sentence was upheld. The case drew widespread attention in the UK media. Headlines called her a jealous girlfriend and violent partner. The story was unsettling because Emma didn't fit the usual public image of a murderer. She wasn't part of a gang. She wasn't someone with a long criminal history. She was a young woman from Leicester, an everyday face. That disconnect made the case all the more shocking. How could an ordinary argument spiral into something so final? How could hesitation in dialing those 3 digits, just 3 numbers, mean the difference between life and death? For James Knight's family, there was no doubt. They described him as a loving son, brother, and friend, whose life was cut short in the most needless way. Outside the courtroom, they expressed relief at the guilty verdicts, but also deep sadness that nothing could bring James back. One of the elements that fascinated observers was the psychological side. Experts highlighted how Emma's difficulty with emotional control may have been a significant factor. But they also emphasized something important. Many people struggle with emotions, arguments, and even volatile relationships, yet they don't cross the line into fatal violence. Emma's case became an example often discussed in criminal psychology, how anger, impulsivity, and a lack of emotional regulation, when combined, can lead to catastrophic decisions in a single heated moment. Rena Salmon, 2002, West London. It's a quiet September morning in West London, 2002. Inside a small, brightly lit beauty salon, customers are expecting nothing more than a routine haircut or manicure, but suddenly the door bursts open. Standing in the doorway is a woman in her late 40s, trembling but determined. In her hand, a small black bag. Inside that bag, a hidden weapon. She isn't here for beauty treatments. She isn't here for conversation. She's here for something else entirely. Within minutes, the peaceful salon turns into the site of a crime that will shock the city, tear apart 2 families, and land this woman, Rena Salmon, in front of a judge and jury, facing the most serious charge in British law. To understand what happened that day, we need to rewind. Rena Salmon was a 43-year-old mother of 2, living what many would describe as a fairly ordinary suburban life. She had been married for years to a man named Paul Salmon. Together, they built what looked like a stable, middle-class home in South Harrow. But behind closed doors, their marriage was falling apart. Paul had grown distant, and Rena suspected he was seeing someone else. Those suspicions weren't just paranoia. Paul had begun a relationship with a 35-year-old woman named Lorna Stewart, a businesswoman who owned a beauty salon in Chiswick, West London. Unlike Rena, Lorna was younger, stylish, and ambitious. And crucially, she was pregnant with Paul's child. For Rena, this revelation was devastating. She wasn't just losing her husband, she was being replaced by someone younger, someone carrying a child. The humiliation and betrayal weighed heavily on her mind. Friends later described her as withdrawn, consumed by the affair, and unable to let go of the betrayal. In the days leading up to the crime, Rena's life seemed to spiral. She struggled with the emotional toll of the affair, thoughts of her husband, and new life with another woman became unbearable. On September 10, 2002, Rena made a decision that would change everything. She borrowed a friend's licensed firearm under the pretense of needing it for protection. But instead of protection, she carried it in her bag as she drove to Chiswick. That morning, she parked near Lorna Stewart's beauty salon. She sat in her car, stewing, rehearsing what she might say, or what she might do. Finally, she gathered herself, walked into the salon, and asked to see Lorna directly. What happened inside was later reconstructed at trial. Rena entered the salon and requested to speak with Lorna in private. Staff members recalled a tense atmosphere as the 2 women disappeared into a back room. Witnesses described muffled voices, raised tones, and then, suddenly, a loud sound that no one expected in such a setting. When staff rushed in, they found Lorna gravely injured. The firearm had been discharged. Panic erupted. Customers screamed. Workers called emergency services. But it was too late. Lorna Stewart lost her life inside her own business, while still pregnant with Paul's child. Rena, meanwhile, didn't flee. She stayed at the scene, visibly shaken, and was later arrested by police, without resistance. At the station, detectives questioned Rena about what had happened. Was this planned? Or had it been an impulsive act in a moment of rage? Rena claimed she hadn't intended to unalive Lorna, that she only wanted to frighten her. She said she hoped to scare Lorna away from her husband, but the evidence suggested otherwise. She had borrowed a gun, traveled across the city, and walked straight into her husband's lover's workplace. For investigators, this wasn't a crime of passion in the heat of the moment. This looked like premeditation. The trial began in 2003 at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. From the very start, it gripped the public. Newspapers labeled Rena the jealous wife and splashed her face across front pages. The prosecution argued that Rena had been consumed by anger, jealousy, and despair. They pointed to the fact that she carried the weapon deliberately into Lorna's workplace. They described it as a calculated act of revenge. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They said Rena was not a cold-blooded planner, but a broken woman, abandoned by her husband and humiliated by his betrayal. They suggested she never intended to take Lorna's life, that it was a tragic accident fueled by despair. But the jury was unconvinced. The fact that she had borrowed a gun, brought it into a salon, and pulled the trigger was too strong to ignore. In 2003, Rena Salmon was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that she serve at least 14 years before being considered for release. For many, the sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the tragic circumstances that led to it. Outside court, there was a mixture of reactions. Lorna's family mourned not only her death, but also the loss of her unborn child. Paul Salmon, caught between his wife and his lover, faced the aftermath of a tragedy that stemmed directly from his choices. And the wider public debated the case endlessly. Was Rena a victim of betrayal pushed to her limits, or was she simply unwilling to accept the end of her marriage? Cases like this always raise deeper questions about the human mind under pressure. Rena's actions weren't those of someone thinking rationally. Psychologists later suggested she was suffering from severe emotional distress, possibly depression, and that the sense of humiliation and betrayal played a critical role in clouding her judgment. But while those factors might explain her mental state, they couldn't excuse her actions. The law drew a clear line. Heartbreak doesn't justify ending another person's life. The Rena Salmon case became one of the most talked about true crime stories in early 2000s Britain. It highlighted how domestic betrayals can spiral into unimaginable violence and how an otherwise ordinary person can cross a line that can never be uncrossed. For many, the tragedy lay not only in the crime itself, but in its ripple effects. 2 children losing their mother to prison, another child never getting the chance to be born, and 2 families destroyed beyond repair. Today, the name Rena Salmon is remembered not as a suburban mother, but as a woman whose heartbreak led to an irreversible decision. A decision made in the quiet of a Chiswick salon on a September morning, with consequences that would echo for decades. It's a chilling reminder that jealousy, anger, and despair, when left unchecked, can lead to the darkest of outcomes. Sharon Carr, 1992, Surrey. It was June, 1992, a warm summer evening in Camberley, Surrey. 20-something Katie Ratcliffe had just spent a night out with friends, enjoying drinks and laughter. Close to midnight, she began her walk home, unaware that someone was watching her. The streets were quiet, the glow of the streetlights falling in patches along the pavement. But what no one could have expected was that Katie's shadow that night wasn't an older man, or even a troubled teen. It was a child, just 12 years old. And that child was about to commit one of the most shocking acts of violence the UK had ever seen. This is the story of Sharon Carr, the girl who would later be known as the UK's youngest female murderer. Sharon Louise Carr was born in Belize in 1979. Her childhood, by most accounts, was far from stable. Reports from those who knew her suggest that Sharon had been exposed to violence from a young age. By the time she moved to the UK with her family, she already showed worrying behavioral problems. Teachers described her as disruptive, volatile, and often aggressive with other children, but even then, nobody imagined what she was capable of. On June 7, 1992, 18-year-old Katie Ratcliffe left a nightclub in Camberley after an evening with friends. Katie was described as bubbly, kind, and full of life. She was looking forward to her future. She had a job, ambitions, and supportive friends and family. But as she walked alone toward her home, she was followed. Her attacker was not a stranger lurking in the dark in the way we often imagine. Instead, it was Sharon Carr, a 12-year-old schoolgirl. In a sudden and brutal act, Sharon attacked Katie with a knife. The attack was frenzied and seemingly without motive. Katie did not know Sharon. They had never spoken. It was random, senseless, and devastating. When her body was discovered, investigators were baffled. Who could have carried out such a vicious attack? Detectives initially looked at older men, boyfriends or predators in the area. The idea that a 12-year-old girl was responsible didn't even cross their minds. And so, for years, the case went cold. 2 years later, in 1994, Sharon Carr's violent behavior escalated. At just 14, she attacked another schoolgirl with a knife, stabbing her repeatedly. The victim survived, but it shocked the community and highlighted Sharon's increasingly dangerous behavior. She was arrested and sent to a young offenders institution, and it was there that her darkest secrets started to come out. While in custody, Sharon began bragging about something far worse than the attack she'd just been jailed for. She told fellow inmates and even staff members that she had already taken a life years earlier. At first, it sounded too wild to be true. A teenager claiming she had killed someone before she was even a teenager? But the details Sharon gave were chillingly accurate. She described attacking a woman, stabbing her repeatedly, and leaving her body behind. The details matched the unsolved case of Katie Ratcliffe. One of the most disturbing elements of Sharon Carr's story was how she described what she had done. While in custody, she wrote in her diary about the killing. In one entry, she referred to the attack as if it had given her a sense of power and thrill. Police officers investigating her confessions said it was like reading the words of someone completely detached from the reality of their crime. And these writings weren't vague. Sharon wrote about stabbing Katie, about the act itself, and even about the emotion she felt at the time. They aligned so closely with the evidence from the crime scene that investigators knew they had their suspect. By 1996, Sharon Carr was formally charged with the murder of Katie Ratcliffe. She was just 16 years old at the time. The case shocked the entire country, not just because of the nature of the crime, but because of Sharon's age when it happened. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a disturbed and violent young girl who had acted out of impulse and fascination with violence. The attack on Katie was not for money, not for revenge, not even personal. It was random. And perhaps that's what made it even more chilling. Sharon pleaded not guilty, but the evidence stacked against her was overwhelming. Her diary entries, her confessions, and the chilling accuracy of her descriptions left little doubt. In March 1997, Sharon Carr was convicted of murder. At 17 years old, she became the youngest female murderer in the UK. The judge sentenced her to life in prison, with a minimum term of 14 years before parole could even be considered. The reaction from the public and the media was one of shock and disbelief. How could a child commit such an act? What had led a 12-year-old girl to take the life of a stranger in such a brutal way? Experts pointed to Sharon's troubled upbringing, her early exposure to violence, and her psychological state. But many argued that those factors, while important, didn't fully explain the randomness of her crime. Sharon Carr has spent most of her life behind bars. Over the years, reports have suggested that she continued to display erratic and violent behavior while imprisoned. Psychiatrists described her as dangerous and deeply disturbed. Unlike many who eventually express remorse, Sharon has often been noted for her lack of it. Instead, she seemed to embrace the notoriety her crime gave her. This only deepened the fear that she could never safely be released into society. The murder of Katie Ratcliffe by Sharon Carr left an indelible mark on the UK. It forced the public and the justice system to confront a disturbing reality. Sometimes, those capable of extreme violence are not who we expect. Nicola Edgington, 2011, London. It was a quiet Monday morning in October 2011 in southeast London when a series of desperate 999 calls came through to emergency services. On the other end of the line was a woman, panicked but strangely detached. She wasn't reporting a crime. She was warning that she was about to commit one. Her name was Nicola Edgington, and within hours, 2 women would be attacked on the street. One would survive, but one would not. This story is unsettling, not just because of the violence itself, but because of the chilling question it raised. Could this tragedy have been prevented? To understand what happened in 2011, we need to step back. Nicola Edgington was born in 1980 and grew up in County Durham, in northeast England. Her childhood wasn't described as particularly unusual, but by her late teens and early 20s, she began experiencing serious mental health struggles. By her early adult life, Nicola had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that can cause delusions, hallucinations, and paranoia. Family and acquaintances would later describe how her mental state seemed unstable, sometimes veering into frightening territory. In 2005, her life spiraled into something that couldn't be ignored. That year, in a disturbing turn of events, Nicola harmed her own mother, Marion, taking her life during what doctors later described as a psychotic episode. She admitted responsibility, but psychiatrists determined that her actions were driven by mental illness rather than deliberate planning. Nicola was sent to a secure hospital instead of prison. After receiving treatment, doctors eventually deemed her stable enough to be released into the community. This decision, years later, would be at the center of enormous controversy. On the morning of October 10, 2011, Nicola was back in southeast London, living independently, but she felt her mental health deteriorating. She claimed she was hearing voices, that she couldn't control her thoughts. Around 4 a.m., she called 999. In a chilling exchange, she told the operator, "I need help. I killed before. I don't want to do it again." She was taken by police to Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Woolwich, where she waited to be assessed. But what followed was a breakdown in communication, and some would argue a failure of the system. Instead of being sectioned under the Mental Health Act and kept under close supervision, Nicola was left in a waiting area. At some point, she managed to leave the hospital. She walked out into the streets of London, no longer a patient under care, but a distressed woman spiraling out of control. Once outside, Nicola wandered into Bexley Heath, a busy part of southeast London. She made her way to a supermarket and purchased a knife. Moments later, she attacked her first victim, Kerry Clark, a 22-year-old woman waiting at a bus stop. Nicola struck her, but Kerry managed to fight back and escape, injured but alive. But Nicola didn't stop. Just minutes later, she came across Sally Hodkin, a 58-year-old legal secretary on her way to work. Sally was a grandmother, well-loved in her community, and completely unaware of the danger she was about to face. Nicola struck, taking Sally's life in the middle of the street. Witnesses rushed to help, but it was too late. Police soon arrived and apprehended Nicola. She didn't resist. The tragedy was complete, but the questions were only just beginning. From the very beginning, the investigation into Nicola Edgington's actions wasn't just about the crime itself, it was about everything that happened leading up to it. Detectives quickly uncovered her history. The 2005 case involving her mother, her schizophrenia diagnosis, her hospital treatment, and most shockingly, the fact that hours before the killing, she had begged for help. In court later, prosecutors would emphasize that she had clearly stated she was dangerous. Her own words showed that she understood what might happen. But mental health specialists argued that Nicola's mind was clouded by illness, that she wasn't in full control of her actions. This tension between responsibility and illness would become the heart of her trial. Nicola Edgington's trial began in 2013 at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. The prosecution laid out the sequence of events clearly. She had called 999, she had gone to the hospital, she had walked out, purchased a knife, and attacked two strangers. The first attack was used as evidence of intent. She had harmed one woman and then deliberately gone on to attack another. Nicola's defense, however, argued diminished responsibility. They said she was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia at the time, and that her actions were not the product of rational thought, but of illness. But the jury didn't accept this explanation fully. They found her guilty of the murder of Sally Hodkin and the attempted murder of Carrie Clark. In March 2013, Nicola was sentenced to 37 years in prison, meaning she would not even be eligible for release until well into middle age. The case sparked outrage and debate across the UK. The family of Sally Hodkin, devastated by the loss, questioned how Nicola had been allowed to walk free from hospital only hours before the killing. The public asked the same questions. How could a woman who had already taken a life in 2005 and who had specifically warned that she might do it again be left unsupervised in a hospital waiting area? Media coverage focused heavily on systemic failures, the gaps between mental health care, hospital procedures, and police responses. Many argued that Sally's death could and should have been prevented. At the core of the case was Nicola's mental illness. Experts testified that she experienced hallucinations and paranoia. But another important point was her awareness of her condition. Unlike some cases where offenders have no insight into their illness, Nicola herself had recognized the danger. She had asked for help. That paradox, of someone both aware and unaware, is what made the case so haunting. It showed the devastating consequences when mental health crises aren't managed swiftly and effectively. In the end, the story of Nicola Edgington isn't just the story of one woman's violent actions. It's also the story of a family shattered, a community in shock, and a system forced to examine its own failures. The tragic death of Sally Hodkin was more than a random act of violence. It was the result of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and the unpredictable nature of untreated mental illness. For the Hodkin family, the pain remains. For the public, the case stands as a chilling reminder. When someone cries out for help, especially in matters of mental health, the cost of ignoring them can be catastrophic. Hannah Donnelly, 2018, Milton Keynes. It was a cold January morning in 2018 when emergency services were called to a quiet home in Milton Keynes. Inside, paramedics found 71-year-old Christopher Donnelly lying on the floor, his body showing clear signs of prolonged suffering. He was unresponsive, and it quickly became clear that this wasn't the result of a simple fall or a sudden illness. Something much darker had been happening behind those walls. And standing nearby, calm and detached, was his wife, Hannah Donnelly. She was the one who had dialed for help. But what paramedics didn't know yet was that she wasn't just the witness to Christopher's final moments. She was the cause. To understand this case, we need to go back years before that morning. Christopher Donnelly was a retired school teacher, a gentleman by all accounts, who had lived a quiet life. Neighbors described him as polite, soft-spoken, and kind. Hannah, his wife, was originally from Germany. Outwardly she appeared bookish and reserved, but behind closed doors she exercised a strict, almost controlling grip over her husband. Their relationship, as later revealed, was far from normal. While the world often hears about men abusing women, this was a case that flipped the script, because Christopher was the victim of a long, drawn-out cycle of domestic abuse. According to evidence presented later in court, Hannah maintained a constant pattern of belittling and physically punishing her husband. It wasn't just a single moment of violence. It was years of cruelty, hidden away from the outside world. She would strike him, degrade him, and subject him to humiliating treatment. He became weaker and more isolated as time went on. Friends and neighbors noticed he looked thinner, frailer. But when asked, Christopher always made excuses. Like so many victims of abuse, he downplayed what was really happened. And that silence allowed the cycle to continue. By early 2018, Christopher's health had deteriorated significantly. On the night before his passing, prosecutors believe he endured yet another violent attack. When paramedics arrived, they found him with extensive injuries, bruises, broken ribs, and internal trauma. The scale of damage made it clear. This wasn't just the result of an accident or a stumble. It was the outcome of repeated assaults over time. Christopher could no longer survive the years of torment he had endured. When police arrived at the Donnelly household, Hannegret tried to present herself as the concerned wife. She suggested that Christopher had fallen, that his injuries were caused by accidents or his own frailty. But detectives weren't convinced. Medical experts quickly determined that his wounds were far too severe to be explained by slips or stumbles. These were injuries consistent with repeated beatings. As they questioned Hannegret further, her demeanor struck investigators as cold and detached. She didn't express much sorrow, and she didn't seem surprised by what had happened. When the case went public, it immediately drew media attention, not just because of the tragic death, but because it challenged public assumptions about domestic violence. Most of the time, society frames abuse as something men do to women. But this case showed that men can be victims too, and that shame, silence, and stereotypes can stop them from seeking help. Charities like Mankind, which support male victims of abuse, highlighted Christopher's case as a tragic example of what can happen when warning signs are overlooked. Throughout the investigation, police began piecing together the psychology of Hannegret Donnelly. Witness statements, medical evidence, and her own words painted a picture of a woman who seemed obsessed with control. She wasn't known for loud outbursts or chaotic rages. Instead, her abuse was systematic, relentless in its consistency. Experts suggested she may have believed her actions were discipline, as though she were punishing Christopher rather than harming him. But make no mistake, her behavior was violent, and it ultimately took his life. In 2019, Hannegret Donnelly went on trial at Luton Crown Court. She was 55 years old at the time, facing charges of murder. Prosecutors laid out the grim reality of what Christopher had endured. They presented evidence of long-term abuse, repeated beatings, bruising, broken bones, and emotional torment. They argued that Christopher had been living under a regime of fear inside his own home, too ashamed or too weak to seek help. The defense tried to argue that Hannegret hadn't meant to end her husband's life, that her actions were not premeditated. They even suggested that her mental state might have clouded her judgment. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated carefully, but in the end they found Hannegret Donnelly guilty of murder. In sentencing her, the judge described the abuse as prolos, angered, and deliberate. He emphasized that Christopher had been a vulnerable man, a husband who should have been safe in his own home, but instead became the victim of years of cruelty. Hannegret was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years before being eligible for parole. The case resonated strongly with the public. Many people were shocked by the idea of a woman committing long-term domestic abuse against her husband. Charities and campaigners urged that Christopher's story serve as a reminder. Abuse does not discriminate. Men can be victims too, and they often face additional barriers when trying to seek help. Social stigma, disbelief, and fear of being ridiculed keep many men silent. This trial forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth that domestic abuse is about power and control, not just gender. Christopher Donnelly's life ended not because of one moment of rage, but because of years of abuse that wore him down until he couldn't endure anymore. His story is tragic, but it also sheds light on the hidden suffering that too many people, especially men, endure in silence. If anything can be learned from this case, it's that we need to listen more carefully, look more closely, and take seriously the possibility that anyone, man or woman, can be a victim of domestic violence. In the end, justice was served in court, but it came far too late for Christopher Donnelly. This was the case of Hannegret Donnelly, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous place isn't a dark alley or a stranger's house, but one's own home. Do you think society still overlooks the reality of male victims of domestic abuse? And what can be done to break the silence for those suffering behind closed doors? Angela Taylor, 2018, Hertfordshire. It was the summer of 2018 in the quiet countryside of Hertfordshire, England, when 69-year-old farmer William Bill Taylor disappeared without a trace. A missing persons report went out, and at first it seemed like a rural mystery. A man who had stepped out, maybe suffered an accident, maybe wandered off. But behind that calm surface was a darker truth. Bill Taylor's disappearance wasn't random, it wasn't an accident. It was the final chapter in a twisted story of betrayal, obsession, and murder, a plot carefully crafted by his wife, Angela Taylor, and her lover, Paul Cannon. When Bill's body was eventually discovered months later in a river not far from his farmland, investigators would uncover a scheme that had been brewing for years, a conspiracy so cold, so deliberate, that it shocked the entire country. And at the center of it all was a woman who was supposed to be his closest companion. Angela Taylor was in her early 50s when she married Bill, a successful and well-established farmer. From the outside, the couple's life looked secure. A big farmhouse, acres of land, and financial stability that came from Bill's hard work. But behind closed doors, things were anything but stable. Angela wasn't content with the marriage. Friends and relatives would later describe years of tension, simmering resentment, and bitter arguments. Bill, by most accounts, was quiet and hard-working, a man who lived for his farm. Angela, on the other hand, seemed restless. What Bill didn't know was that his wife had been carrying on a secret affair with another man, Paul Cannon, a mechanic she had met online. Paul was younger, brash, and more than willing to feed Angela's desire for excitement. Their relationship quickly became intense, and before long, Angela and Paul were exchanging not only passionate messages, but also chilling conversation about wanting Bill out of the picture. By the time summer of 2018 rolled around, Bill had begun to suspect something was wrong. He confided in friends that he feared for his life, that Angela wanted him dead. At one point, he even told a neighbor, "If I go missing, it will be her." Those words would come back to haunt the investigation. On the evening of June 3, 2018, Bill Taylor was last seen alive. The next morning, his Land Rover was found abandoned near his farmland. His disappearance sparked immediate concern. Police and volunteers combed through fields, rivers, and villages nearby, but no sign of Bill turned up. Angela played the part of the worried wife. She gave interviews, appeared upset, and insisted she had no idea where her husband had gone. But her performance didn't convince everyone. Investigators noticed something in her demeanor, not grief, not panic, but detachment. For weeks, Bill's disappearance remained a mystery. Then, in February 2019, his badly decomposed body was found in the River His, about a mile from his home. The discovery confirmed what many had feared from the beginning. Bill hadn't simply wandered off. He had been murdered. The focus quickly turned to Angela and her lover. Detectives uncovered hundreds of text messages between Angela and Paul Cannon. They weren't just lovers, they were conspirators. In one message, Angela chillingly wrote, "I'm not giving up until he's gone." Paul replied with fantasies about Bill's death, even suggesting ways it could happen. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment attack. It was a cold, calculated plan to remove Bill permanently. When police brought Angela in for questioning, she denied everything. She claimed she wanted no harm to come to her husband, that she was being misunderstood. But as investigators laid out the mountain of evidence, the texts, the secret meetings, the financial motives, her story began to crumble. Paul Cannon was also arrested, and the two lovers turned on each other, each trying to distance themselves from the murder plot. But their words in those messages were damning. They spoke about Bill as if he were an obstacle, not a human being. Prosecutors later argued that Angela stood to gain not just freedom from her marriage, but also financially from Bill's death. She wanted his farm, his money, his assets, and with Paul by her side, she thought she had the perfect partner in crime. The trial took place in 2019 at St. Albans Crown Court. The courtroom was packed with reporters, locals, and Bill's devastated family. The prosecution laid out its case with chilling precision. Angela and Paul had plotted Bill's death for months, and though the exact method of the killing wasn't clear due to the state of his body, the intent was undeniable. The jury heard how Angela had manipulated those around her, presenting herself as the worried wife while secretly celebrating her husband's absence. They listened to the venom in her texts, the fantasies she and Paul had shared, and the cold indifference with which she described her husband. Angela's defense team tried to paint her as a vulnerable woman swept up in a toxic relationship with Paul Cannon. They suggested she had been pressured, influenced, even manipulated herself. But the jury wasn't convinced. The sheer volume of evidence showed Angela wasn't a passive participant. She was driving the plan forward. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Both Angela Taylor and Paul Cannon were found guilty of murder. The judge's words were damning. He described Angela as manipulative and ruthless, and Paul as her willing accomplice. Angela Taylor was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. Paul Cannon received a minimum of 22 years. For Bill's family, the sentence brought some closure, but no comfort. They had lost a father, a grandfather, and a respected member of their community to a crime driven by greed and betrayal. The case of Angela Taylor is a stark warning. Sometimes the most dangerous people aren't lurking in the shadows, but sitting right across the dinner table. These cases are a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always come in expected forms, and sometimes it hides behind a familiar face. Each of these women left a mark on British history, terrifying, tragic, and unforgettable. Which case shocked you the most, and which cases do you want us to cover next? Let us know in the comments below. I read every single one. For more daily deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's always another story waiting, and you won't want to miss it.